After the 7-hour drive from Connecticut, Rick and Bill were following Joe Spence's directions to his camp on Chebencook Pond. Nutting Road for 5 miles, then right onto a dirt road marked by a row of mailboxes beneath a stand of birches. Bumping along with the boat behind, they crossed the abandoned railroad line that Joe had noted. Even though he knew the railroad map of northern Maine, Rick had searched this one anyway, a Maine Central branch abandoned over a decade ago. They'd come across it at different locations on past trips. Here, its right-of-way through the woods remained clearly evident, no doubt from snowmobile and ATV use. In another half-mile, the waters of Chebencook Pond appeared through the trees. They passed 2 camps and pulled in at the third. Joe's camp looked like a good basic setup with a tent platform, picnic table, fire pit, and one holler outhouse off in the woods. Nice water frontage, with the boat launch in front of the parking spot. On their previous annual Maine fishing trips, they'd always camped at the state park on Moosehead Lake. When Bill's work colleague offered his camp, they jumped at the chance to try something new, away from the state park bustle. From the shore, they counted a half-dozen cabins scattered around the pond. Joe had talked up the fishing on Chebencook, and they planned to try their luck tomorrow. The first night, they usually went into town for dinner, but they were farther away from town this time and running late anyway, so they decided to stick to camp and go in for breakfast instead. Cranking up the Coleman, they dined on a couple of cans of Dinnymore beef stew and discussed the possibilities for the next day. After cleaning up and checking the pond view once more, before long they were ready for the sack. Rick was drifting off when the sound of a train horn brought him back. There it was again, blowing for a grade crossing. Now he heard the rumble of diesel engines. He checked his watch. 10:05. Where was it? The nearest active rail line was the Canadian Pacific Main, at least 20 miles away. He'd never heard a train in all their years up here. What in the hell? Beside him, Bill groaned and rolled over in his sleeping bag. Bill couldn't give a crap about a train. The sound intensified as Rick stared out the tent into the nighttime woods. Not far off now, and no doubt where it was coming from, the old railroad bed they'd crossed on the way in. He could hear the occasional squeal of steel wheels against steel rails as the train moved along. Moving slowly, unlikely as it seemed, there must still be rails hidden somewhere in those weeds. Maybe the branch had been revived as a short line or a tourist operation. He awaited the horn blast for their road crossing. Gone. It was gone. The sound just cut. No fading away as the train moved past. No horn, nothing. His hearing? His mind? It was weirder than the train itself. He again recalled past years. For sure he would have heard this train from Moosehead. His online search had shown nothing about the line being back in use, but he'd check again in the morning. Rick related his story as Bill drove into town the next morning. Bill dismissed it as probably a big semi going by somewhere. Figured with Bill. Rick gave the abandoned rail the long look as they passed by. See anything? Nada, Rick answered. He waited with phone in hand. With one bar he Googled Maine Railroads map. The search result came up just as he expected. No active rail line for at least 20 miles in any direction. At the Pine Tree Diner, they sat at the counter bannering with the stocky cook at the grill. He was new since last year and full of questions for them. Where were they from? Were they up here for fishing? Where were they camping? At that, Rick saw his opening. Got a question maybe you can answer. Last night, a little after 10, I heard a train passing pretty close by. I'm in a train, so it got me wondering. I didn't think there were any tracks still in use around here. I saw that old right-of-way from the road going in, but that's long gone, so I can't figure where that train was. The cook looked at him funny. Oh yeah, lots of people camping in the woods around here will tell you they heard that train. Some say there's a story behind it, but since no one has actually seen a train, I think it's all a bunch of bunk. So what's the story? Asked Rick. Well, it goes back to the early 60s when the railroad wanted to end the passenger train business on that line. All that was left by then was the mixed train to Farmington, one passenger car attached to the local freight. Up in Kentfield, there was a woman named Mary Karen who rode that train 3 or 4 times a week down to Farmington to babysit her grandkids while her daughter worked a part-time job. From everything I've heard, you didn't want to get on the wrong side of Mary Karen. She was ripped when the railroad asked the state for the okay to drop the service, and furious when the state approved it. She was on the very last train to Farmington, of course. But as it turned out, that wasn't the end of it. A couple of weeks later, she got herself arrested for sitting on the tracks in Kentfield, blocking the freight train from coming through. I remember as a kid seeing the picture in the paper. It was June, I think, and she was sitting on the rail in a big wide straw hat. I thought she was nutty. So there's your story. Doesn't make much sense, though, even if you believe in ghost trains, because the freight trains kept running on that line for another 20 years with no problems. The ghost train stories didn't start until after they abandoned it altogether about 10 years ago. The track pulled up, ripped it all out. So how can you have a train where there's no track? Rick didn't mention the strange sound sequence from last night. He'd keep that to himself until he had a chance to hear it again. So what happened to Mary? The judge gave her a good talking to and put her on probation for a year, and that was that. Oh well, Mary never caused any more trouble. She left town a few years later. Must have been in her 80s by then. Probably went to live with her daughter. But I never heard say for sure. Hooey, we've got a real-life Maine ghost story to tell him back home. Bill hooped on the way back. Sure, except I heard a train, not a ghost, Rick retorted. Okay, Ghostbuster. If it involves a train, you'll figure it out, I'm sure. Absolutely, said Rick. He was used to Bill's ribbing about his railfan intensity. It went with the territory. Back at camp, Rick put the mystery aside to enjoy the day ahead. They were on the water by 8:30, the trolling motor pushing them slowly across Chebencook. Over the next couple of hours, they reeled in and tossed back 4 undersized smallmouth bass. They hit the water again after lunch, and by late afternoon had 3 decent-sized bass to cook up for dinner. Joe had been right on the money about fishing Chebencook. As for last night's mystery, the only sounds Rick heard were the sounds of the lake. The breeze, the lapping water, occasional ducks quacking, a crow. Still, as he savored their catch at dinner, he entertained just one thought. Would the train come again tonight? Maybe the cook was wrong about the tracks being pulled up, or, he had to admit, maybe he himself was wrong. Maybe the sound wasn't a train at all. He lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening. Sure enough, right on time there was the horn blowing for the distant crossing, followed by the engine thrum. Louder, steadily louder before it abruptly went silent like a flipped switch, leaving Bill's snoring the only sound. Okay, no doubt now whether he'd heard correctly. Leaning his head back to look out the tent at the starry sky above, he knew where he'd be tomorrow night. In the morning, his plan got another predictable response from Bill. Okay, good luck, Ghostbuster. I'll stick to camp. At 9:30 that night, he set out for the half-mile walk to the crossing. A light breeze soughed through the pine woods. At the crossing, he turned right and walked a distance up the old rail. He didn't want to be spotted by anyone passing on the road. Occasionally, he paused to scuff the ground, hitting nothing but stones and weeds. When he came upon an old milepost, he stopped and waited. He heard the diesel growl first, then the horn. A minute or so later he saw a light playing off the woods. Then the headlight pierced the darkness. The train slowly approached, a passenger train with 2 F-unit engines and a string of old coaches. A passenger train in northern Maine? Oh sure. In the headlight's beam, Rick eyed the weedy roadbed ahead of the advancing train. No rails were in sight. The train slowed as it approached. The beat-up F-units were faded green, streaked with yellow. Probably Maine Central, but no visible markings to confirm. No markings on the gray passenger coaches, either. Only one, near the middle, was lit. When the train groaned to a stop, that coach stood in front of him. The door opened, and a uniformed conductor appeared. Gaunt, bespectacled, and up there in years, he dropped the steps and looked down at Rick. Well, we haven't got all night, he said in a thin, reedy voice. Come on aboard if you're coming. Take the chance? Marcy would call him crazy, or worse, but Marcy was home in Connecticut. He needed to find the answer. The conductor extended his hand. He grabbed it and clambered aboard. He'd ride to the next stop, whatever it was, and call Bill to come pick him up. Inside, the coach was bathed in an odd, bluish light from a source he couldn't determine. It appeared to be about half full. No one paid him any notice as he took a seat just inside the door. The locomotives accelerated, the train jerked, and they began to move. From underneath came the rumble of steel wheels on steel rails. The sliding car door bang closed behind him. As the conductor passed by, Rick got his attention. When is the next stop, and what's the fare? I'll be getting off there. The conductor smiled wanly. Sorry, sir. Once you're on this train, there's no getting off. And don't worry, there's no fare. The conductor moved on before Rick could find a response. What in the hell had he gotten himself into? He rose halfway for a better look at his fellow passengers. They made an odd sight. Everyone seated, erect, looking straight ahead, silent and perfectly still. Men and women, young and old. One head did stand out from the rest. A woman near the front wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat. As he sat back down, the train suddenly went silent. No rumble of the rails, no locomotive sound. But the gentle rocking told him they were still moving. Had they crossed the road yet? Nothing but blackness out the window. Okay, he'd screwed up. How was he going to get off? At this speed, jumping should be easy. Rick rose but found the door locked. He returned to his seat and closed his eyes to focus. He could see the headline now. Police search for missing Connecticut man. The county sheriff suspended the search for Rick after 2 weeks. They found his footprints soon enough, leading about a quarter mile up the rail. The pattern indicated he'd stood for a time near an old milepost. But that was it. Search crews combing the surrounding woods came up empty. With so little evidence, the sheriff couldn't speculate on what had happened to Rick. As the weeks passed, the story fell off the front page and soon disappeared entirely, revived only by the obligatory 1-year anniversary update. No new leads in man's disappearance. Among the local wags, however, the story remained an engaging topic of conversation. A few old-timers scoffed at all the speculation. From the moment they heard about the account his buddy gave to the authorities, they knew what had happened to Rick. He'd fallen victim to the ghost train that haunted the abandoned railroad line. The authorities, of course, gave zero credence to that theory. The train was moving through the countryside at a steady pace. It was late at night, and most of the passengers were asleep. The only sound was the rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the train shuddered to a halt. The lights flickered, and the passengers were thrown from their seats. They looked around, confused and frightened, as they tried to figure out what had happened. The conductor rushed down the aisle, a look of panic on his face. He told the passengers that they had hit something on the tracks, but he wasn't sure what. He promised to investigate and let them know what was happening. As the conductor left, the passengers sat in silence, waiting for news. But the silence was soon broken by the sound of footsteps on the roof of the train. They sounded heavy and uneven, like someone or something was walking across the metal roof. The passengers looked at each other in fear, wondering what could be making the sound. Suddenly, the door to one of the cabins burst open, and a young woman stumbled out. She was pale and shaking, and her eyes were wide with terror. "There's someone in my cabin," she whispered. "I saw him in the window." The other passengers tried to calm her down, but they too were beginning to feel uneasy. They had heard stories of ghosts on trains, but they had never believed them until now. As they sat in silence, waiting for the conductor to return, they heard more noises on the roof. This time, it sounded like something was scratching at the metal. The passengers looked up, but they couldn't see anything in the darkness outside. Just then, the lights flickered again, and the train lurched forward. The passengers were thrown from their seats once more, and they could hear the sound of metal scraping against metal. They realized with horror that the train was moving again, even though the conductor hadn't returned. They tried to open the doors, but they were stuck fast. They were trapped on the train, with no way to escape. As they sat in the darkness, they heard the sound of footsteps again, this time coming from inside the train. They were getting closer, and the passengers could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, the door to the cabin burst open, and a figure stepped out. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a pale face and dark eyes. He looked around the carriage, his eyes fixed on the passengers. One by one, he approached them, his hand outstretched. The passengers tried to move away, but they were paralyzed with fear. The man touched each of them lightly on the forehead, and then he vanished into thin air. The passengers were left alone in the darkness, with no idea of what had just happened. They tried to stay calm, but their nerves were frayed. They had no idea what was going to happen next. Suddenly, the train shuddered to a halt again. The lights flickered, and then went out completely. The passengers were plunged into darkness, with only the sound of their breathing to keep them company. And then, from somewhere outside the train, they heard the sound of laughter. It was high-pitched and mocking, and it sent chills down their spines. The laughter grew louder and louder until it filled the carriage. The passengers huddled together, praying for the train to start moving again. But it never did. They were trapped on the train, with no way to escape the ghostly presence that had taken over. The passengers were never seen again. Some say that they were trapped on the train forever, doomed to ride through the darkness for all eternity. Others say that they were taken. Some say that they were taken by the ghostly presence, dragged off the train and into the night. And there are those who say that they never even existed, that the train and its passengers were nothing more than a ghostly apparition, a figment of the imagination. But one thing is certain, the train is still out there, haunting the countryside with its ghostly presence. And those who hear the sound of its whistle in the night know to stay far away, lest they become its next victims. There have been reports of sightings over the years, from those who claim to have seen the train speeding through the darkness. They say that it's always the same, a ghostly locomotive, with steam pouring from its engine and a long line of carriages trailing behind. The sound of its whistle is said to be deafening, a haunting wail that sends shivers down the spine. And those who get too close say that they can feel the presence of the passengers, trapped inside the train for all eternity. But there are those who seek out the train, drawn by the mystery and the horror of its legend. They go in search of the ghostly locomotive, armed with cameras and recording devices, hoping to capture evidence of its existence. Some say that they've succeeded, that they have photos and recordings that prove that the train is real. But others are skeptical, dismissing the sightings as nothing more than hoaxes and urban legends. And so the legend of the haunted train lives on, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors that lurk in the darkness. The passengers may be long gone, but their ghostly presence lingers on, haunting those who dare to seek them out. One of the most chilling stories about the haunted train comes from a group of teenagers who decided to investigate the legend for themselves. They had heard the stories and seen the videos, but they didn't believe that the train was real. So, one night, they set out to prove it. They parked their car by the side of the tracks and waited for the train to appear. As the night wore on, they grew restless and bored and began to wonder if they had made a mistake. But just as they were about to leave, they heard it, the distant sound of a whistle, growing louder and louder with each passing moment. At first, they were excited, thinking that they had finally found the haunted train. But as it grew closer, they realized that something was wrong. The whistle was too loud, too piercing, and there was something eerie about the way it echoed through the night. The train appeared suddenly, speeding towards them with incredible speed. The teenagers froze, too terrified to move as the locomotive thundered past them. The noise was deafening, and the air was filled with the sound of grinding metal and hissing steam. As the train passed by, they could see the passengers inside, staring out at them with empty eyes. They were all dressed in clothes from another time, and their faces were twisted in expressions of agony and despair. The teenagers ran back to their car, too frightened to look back as the train disappeared into the night. They never spoke of the incident again, but they knew that they had seen something that was beyond explanation. And so the legend of the haunted train continues, a story that is passed down from generation to generation. Some believe it to be true, while others dismiss it as nothing more than a myth. But for those who have seen it with their own eyes, there is no doubt that the haunted train is real, and that its ghostly presence lingers on, haunting the countryside and those who dare to seek it out. There is a story about a train that will stop and bring you inside when you try to follow the railway, or stand in the middle of the rail at nightfall on Friday 13th. But this train only stops when you are worthy to join the ride. This train will give you a short trip inside the ghostly train and put you at the place where you came from. But sometime, it will take you forever until the end of the day. A good story will be more interesting with some secret recipe lie. Like other urban legend and myth, I try to think that it's just local stories to make children away from the railway, or someone who's curious about anything creepy. Some people just try to make story that using train are creepy and causing horror, especially at night. The newest story told that, not only Friday 13th, but every day after 11 p.m., they say, you will get a ticket before they invite you to join the trip. More and more lying added, and make the urban legend become a challenge for people in my town. Some people said, many of them not return after practice the challenge. My opinion about this urban legend still become my idealism to not believe it. Until last year, a friend of mine disappeared when trying to proof this story. That time, I still have a contact with him until time in my phone show 11 p.m. The last text he gave me before I lost contacts with him. Hey dude, I found a train ticket in my pocket. I see my name texted in this ticket. Haha. After that day, nothing found it in the location. When I tried to show them the last contact between me and my friend, police suspected me as a criminal who caused this problem. Nightmare starts to swarm around my mind day after day since my friend vanished from this world. Every time I hang out, people turn his face or are staring me like a bad people. 10 months since I decided to lock in my house. 2 days until a year since my friend gone without any clue to be found. I start to bored and hate this condition that I'm planning to redeem my sin. I decide to search my friend in the same time when he disappears, Friday 13th. After pack everything that was useful like food and drink, I leave when the clock display 9 p.m. I start my expedition from nearby train station, track down until 2 hours later. I reach the location where my friend's last position that time. Along the way, I still not find any single clue about my friend. Tired and exhausted, I sit in the side of the railway to open my drinking water. Not far from my location, I saw a small sheet of paper on the ground. When I tried to take that paper vanished. At least, I still managed to realize those paper are train ticket in blue color with name of someone I know, Bella. She is Bob's girlfriend. Bob is the name of my friend of mine who disappeared last year. A moment later, I feel my pocket warming, an abnormal warm. When I try to search what happened, I find a ticket in red color, a train ticket with my name texted on it. Something not right about this thing. Something like dark spell cursed this ticket. The detail of the ticket makes me more feeling horror. Scared, I crumple the ticket and throw it to my back. 5 minutes passed after 11 p.m. When I decide to come home, a light came from the left side of my face. Something coming, a train with pure black color covering a wagon. The train stopped in front of me, right before the last wagon passed my face. The door opened, mist come out from inside the train. A voice without master came out from inside the train. Do you have the ticket, sir? My body can't move. Breeze winds surround me. A silent pain crawls inside my soul. Only a single word that can speak out from my mouth. No, a moment later, the voices continue to speak. So, you throw out your ticket? What a pity, but still, a wise choose of you, sir. After that, the door closed and the trains begin to moving forward. From this day, I learned 2 things about this real urban legend. First, there is 3 ticket types as I know to enjoy this ghostly train, yellow, blue, and red color. Second, always read the destination and trip duration. The reason I throw out that ticket, because detail of the ticket texted one-way ticket, lifetime duration, and the destination is to the end of your life. Just my perception that my friend Bob is get the ticket without read the detail. He invited Bella, his girlfriend, to join the challenge. Both of them get the ticket, but Bella realized and run away after throw out his ticket behind her. The story about one-day trip is a lying. Only one time in life that they serve to their passenger. Always watch the detail of the books you want to buy before you regret that moment you buy those things.